Welcome to part 3 of Reasoning Through the Bible's Slavery Apologetics, where they try to make biblical slavery seem like it was actually a good thing meant to protect people. But any form of slavery is bad. There's no such thing as a good form of slavery. Anything that comes after owning other human beings as property is something else. If you're starting with slavery, it's already immoral, and it was absolutely condoned by God himself. God gave these laws to his people who would at the time have had no form of slavery of their own. God gave them their slavery. All in all, it makes no sense. But we're going to get right into it. If you're new to this channel, please like and subscribe if you enjoy any of this content. If you enjoy seeing these longer form videos of apologists trying to reconcile the atrocities of the Bible with an all-loving God, go ahead and subscribe, and we're going to get right into this. Let's go.
Hello and welcome to Reasoning Through the Bible. My name's Glenn and I'm here with Steve. And this is part 3 of a topical series we're doing on slavery. And if you're not familiar with our work, then I would encourage you to look at the main thrust of our work, which is to do verse-by-verse Bible study. And we go passage by passage, verse by verse, and explain the text. And as we go along, we talk about issues. And we've bumped into an issue of slavery. And so we're taking our time to slow down just a little bit.
It's funny because in this video series, they absolutely do not go passage by passage, verse by verse. They jump all around from the New Testament to the Old Testament, from different books that are within the Bible. They definitely don't do a line for line, verse for verse study.
And go through some of these passages, these kind of problem passages and questionable passages that deal with the issue of slavery. And because slavery is such a sensitive issue, as is understandable, and there's so much pain in the world because of it.
Goodness. Okay, so we're already we're less than a minute in because I skipped their little intro, they're coming up where they show a later clip of the video. In the beginning, I skipped that. So we're like 30 seconds into this video and he's already repeating himself from part 1 and part 2. And I was excited for this video series because they were so long. And usually when you come across slavery apologetics specifically, they're very short videos where they kind of touch here, they kind of touch there, and then move on quickly. I was like, oh man, these videos are long. They're going to really dive into this issue, but they don't. The reason that these videos are so long is because they're like me. They go off on random tangents that kind of don't have anything to do with the video topic at hand. And if they cut all that out, they probably spend less than half of that time actually talking about slavery in the Bible.
Then, therefore, we thought it wise to explain what the Levitical law and in the New Testament says about it. And Steve, this has been kind of interesting to me, but we're into part 3 now. So if you didn't hear the first 2, we'd encourage you to go back and listen to those.
Yeah, because it is detailed, and we do go into
yeah. So same thing that these guys are saying here. This is part 3 of this series. I already covered part 1 and 2, and they really don't go into detail. They read a line, then they read what they think that the line should mean, then they bring other passages in, and just watch the other 2 videos. It really makes no sense. They go into a lot of detail about how the biblical laws apply to everybody, slave and free. But of course, that can't be the case. It just can't be the case. That's dumb to even say that. But after they say that biblical laws applied equally to everybody, slave and free, then they go into very explicit ways about how slaves are treated differently. It's really stupid.
detailed. We try and keep our sessions around a 30-minute mark. Occasionally we go over, but in the last 2 sessions, we've gone over about 10 or 15 minutes. And so we've gone into plenty of detail. And in order to put the part 3 into context, listen to part 1 and part 2.
And again, what we're doing is explaining these passages, but we're also trying to answer some of the questions that arise in the minds of Christians and in the minds of skeptics and atheists, because slavery is such an emotional, painful issue. Then the people that are attempting to tear down the Bible and attack God use these passages just because they are so emotional. I remember years ago.
They don't use the passages because they're so emotional. They use these passages because they're so atrocious. They're awful, awful passages that deal with the topic of owning other human beings as property. That's why they use the passages, not because it's emotional. It's because they're disgusting, and it kind of proves that your God, this God, the Christian God, the God of the Bible, the God of the New Testament, cannot exist. You cannot have a God who gives rules and regulations of how to own other human beings as property and also call him all loving. That makes no sense. You cannot have a God who commands the genocide of an entire nation of people and then call him an all loving God. It's contradictory. It makes no sense. That God cannot exist.
When slavery wasn't on the front of everybody's minds, then we didn't hear much from the atheists. But suddenly, when it gets to be a sensitive issue, then they drag out these favorite chestnuts. As we said in the first and second one,
Suddenly, when it gets to be a sensitive issue, when did slavery suddenly get to be a sensitive issue?
slavery is real. It's very painful. We're not trying to dodge that. What we are trying to do is very directly deal with what the Bible says about it. And we've gone through in some detail here. So if you have your Bibles, turn to Exodus chapter 21. And
Oh, I didn't bring up my my Bible. Hold on. I like to read along as they cover it. I like Bible study tools. Do I like Bible study tools? Yeah, Bible study tools. Sorry, hold on one sec. No, this isn't it. Yes, it is. Bible study tools. I like Bible study tools. It's pretty streamlined. I like to use Bible study tools when I follow along with my Bible. Where are we turning to? Exodus.
last time we spent quite a bit of time on Exodus 21, verse 21, which is one of the ones that, again, our friends in the skeptic and atheist community use to say, Exodus 21:21. If you're, well, let's start in verse 20. If a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and he dies at his hand, he shall be punished. However, if they lose time. And what we made a big point about was that in several passages, all people are treated the same. It is not the case that someone can, oh, he's my bondservant, my bondslave, so I can abuse him at will as I would a piece of farm equipment. That nothing could be further from the truth. Look down at verses 23 and through 25. If there's any further
Yeah, sure. It does say this, but um this is not refer all of these rules don't apply equally to everybody. That's why they bring up the slaves in the first place. If it applied to everybody, anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. This You can't make this make sense with this. This is talking about if people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the husband's woman demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, fan for bird, bruise for bruise. This is talking about these 24 through or 22 through 25 is bear in mind that the Bible wasn't written with numbers. There's no such thing as, Exodus 21 verse 22. It's all one long story from beginning to end. These numbers were added in to help people keep track of stuff. Excuse me. So you can't, so sentences, verses 22 through 25 are speaking of the same thing. This is if people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman. This is protections for a pregnant woman. This isn't saying if there is serious injury. Okay, but the key word here is but. But if there is serious injury, this is referring to this. But there is no serious injury to the pregnant woman or the baby. This is saying, but there is no serious injury, then the offender will be fined. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand. This doesn't apply to everybody, and it especially doesn't apply to the slaves, because just before that, anyone who beats their male or female slave, and they don't die after okay, I'll just read it. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two. They are not to be punished. Now, how do you make that make sense with you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, for bruise for bruise? You can't make that make sense. In the verse just before, you're not to be punished if your slave doesn't die. But you're also supposed to give bruise for bruise. That would be being punished. These are two separate things. One is dealing with if people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman, and one is dealing with slaves. Stop trying to just marry all these passages together. It doesn't make any sense. But we will keep going.
And so with that, that prevents all of this accusation of you can just abuse a slave. And we pointed out that over in
It doesn't matter if you can just abuse a slave and treat him like a piece of farm equipment. That's not the claim that's being made. The claim that's being made is that you are allowed to strike your property, and that property is a human being. You're allowed to strike them. They are your property. They are your slave. You own them. I don't care what the period of time is for. I don't care if it's a day. I don't care if it's for life. It's immoral. I don't care if you can beat them to within an inch of their life and treat them like farm equipment, or if you can just give them a little tap. You have no right to make physical contact with anybody else in a violent manner. So I don't care to the extent it's slavery, it's immoral.
Leviticus, I believe it was 24, had the very same language that all people have to be treated equally under the law. Slaves cannot be isolated for abuse.
Yeah, all of these laws that we're going through here, they're deterrents. Here are people that have put themselves.
So, okay, I think a good analogy to make all of this to make all of this come crumbling down is if you are absolutely not allowed to physically motivate, we'll say, your slave. You cannot give him any physical punishment whatsoever, lest that physical punishment be done to you as well. That's the argument they're making. They're saying that if you do anything to your slave, it's wound for wound, it's bruise for bruise. What incentive would a slave have to follow any order you give them and not simply just walk away? If the law applies equally to all people, slave and free, and even they would admit that a type of slavery is a prisoner of war. If you go into a nation and you capture one, their army, it surrenders, whatever, and you have to now deal with the enemy army, with the hostile army, how do you make them do anything? They're a hostile army. So according to the Bible, you would either slaughter them or take them into some type of slavery, some type of forced labor. But how would you make that hostile army that you just captured, how would you make them do anything? You can't hit them. You can't punish them, because then you would also be hit and be punished. Do you see what I'm saying? It makes no sense. Of course, it's not talking about slaves in these passages. It's talking about free people. Don't kill, don't hit, don't punish, don't fight, whatever, with your fellow Israelites. And that's another thing that we haven't even got into yet. Everything that we're reading right now are laws for Hebrews and Hebrew slaves. It clearly states that in the beginning of Exodus 21 that these laws are applied to Hebrew slaves. But if you take a war party captive and you cannot do anything physical to them, because all people, and it may sound stupid, but that is the argument that they are making. Even those war slaves, your slaves, the slaves that you buy from the nations around you, all slaves must be treated as equals. Eye for eye, foot for foot, wound for wound, tooth for tooth, bruise for bruise. He's saying that all it, of course, that's silly. The war party would simply walk away and regroup and maybe come back to kill you, maybe not. I don't know, but do you see how it's so obvious that the wound for wound stuff does not apply to slaves? It simply doesn't. To say that it does is stupid.
Into voluntary servitude for various reasons that we pointed out and went through in detail in part 1. These are deterrents in order to let the people know that, look, because they have put themselves in voluntary servitude or put themselves in servitude to you or are under servitude to you or noted here as slaves, that you can't abuse them. There's punishments that's going to be revolve around that or evolve from that, and that they also have rights to go before judges. We're going to see that in a little bit. So even though they're these bond slaves, bond servants, maid servants, they have rights as well.
And had to be treated equally.
So yeah, he's going to the head. I don't care if they had rights. If they had rights, then hey, I guess that's good. But they're still slaves. They're still not free people. They're still owned by another person. That's the crux of this argument. Anything that comes after the ownership of another human being is irrelevant. I don't care. I don't care if they were treated so amazingly. It doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is that they were not autonomous. They were not free to go. They're not free to make their own choices as a human being because they were property. They were owned by somebody else. It's immoral, no matter how great you try to make that sound. It's immoral, and it was condoned and sanctioned by God himself.
Under the law. So again, look at verse 25. Burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. And verse 23, any further injury. And if they did have this happen to a slave, what would they do? Look at the end of verse 22. May demand of him, and he shall pay as the judges decide. So there was a system of judges.
So he's really trying to make the end of verse 22. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely and there's no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. He's trying to make this sound like it applies to slaves as well. Come on, like did you not read the rest of the sentence? In which way, shape, or form does this apply to slaves? To suggest this is just asinine. It's so obviously incorrect. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there's no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband, not the woman for some reason, but the woman's husband demands and the court allows. He's really trying to make the argument that this also means that if you hit a slave, if people are, it's, do you see what, come on. Let's stop being silly here.
And if we would have just taken the time to have read through the book of Exodus, we found that there was a whole chapter there where they set up a system of judges over large numbers and then hundreds and tens. There was a system. This was the beginning of the rabbinical system of judges, where anyone, slave or free, could say, hey, I've been bruised. I had an injury to me. Any further injury, this was unjust. Just because I owed this man money and had to go to work for him, I was under a bond. They abused me. And the judge would then make a decision. They had rights. It was.
Is that not one of the dumbest things you've ever heard come out of a slavery apologist's mouth? I just went over it, but how can you make that make sense, that if you're bruised as a slave, under what obligation would a slave have to remain a slave if you could not physically discipline? Do you just ask them nicely, hey, would you please go get my farm, my land? And the slave's like, no, I'm okay. And you're just like, please, will you do it? And the slave's just like, nah, bro, I'm good. I'm not going to do that. You know what I mean? There's no, that's dumb to suggest. Nobody would remain a slave.
is very similar to what happens in the military. There's, if you go join the military, they're going to tell you in advance what the rules are, right? Part of the rules, they're going to tell you what clothes you have to wear and where you can go and where you can't go and when you can go there and when you can't, how much you're going to get paid, what you have to say and how you have to say it, what your job's going to be. And in return, you have, as a soldier, have rights. And you can go before a tribunal and say, my commanding officer abused me and violated the rules because, and you lay out your case and the tribunal would decide. Same exact situation here. There are judges. Again, look at end of verse 22. As the judges decide, there were a system of judges, and even down verse 25, if they get bruised even or any further injury, then they have the bond slaves.
Again, he's repeating the point over and over again, so I will repeat it over and over again as well. In no way, shape, or form can you misconstrue this passage to apply to slaves as well. Even if you somehow could make it apply to slaves, it would still only apply to Israelite slaves, fellow Hebrew slaves. And even if you could make it apply to fellow Hebrew slaves, you could only make it apply to this form of indentured servitude, this other immoral form of slavery, where your choices are to sell yourself to a person for 7 years, X odd years, in return for food so you don't die, which is pretty disgusting too. But even if you could make all of those things make sense, it would still only apply to those slaves. If you're going to honestly sit here and try to tell me that it applies to war captives or slaves that you buy from the nations around you, just that's the most stupid thing I've ever heard. We'll keep going.
Have rights.
And another thing is they tried in the previous videos, they tried to make it sound like they're like, if you find a runaway slave, then you're supposed to clothe him and feed him, because if he ran away, that means his master wasn't treating him correctly. So think about that for a second. If this applies to all slaves, why wouldn't every slave simply just run away, and then they could just go get the food and all the great treatment? It's so stupid. It's so stupid.
System had to treat everybody the same. To take this and wrench it from its context and make it sound like the slaves are just a piece of farm equipment, nothing could be further from the truth.
You see, he keeps putting that in. He's adding that in, that they have to be treated like a piece of farm equipment. Nobody's saying that they're treated like a piece of farm equipment. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't, but it's irrelevant. That's an irrelevant point. It doesn't matter if they were treated like a piece of farm equipment. He's pulling at your heartstrings. It's an argument from emotion. They were treated like a piece of farm equipment, but that doesn't matter. Even if they were treated relatively well, they're still slaves. It's still immoral. You can try to make biblical slavery. If the argument here is that biblical slavery was not the absolute most disgusting, barbaric form of slavery you could imagine in your head, fine, I agree. It's probably not. You can imagine far worse than biblical slavery. The fact of the matter is that it was humans owning other humans as property. Nothing more needs to be said. It's disgusting. It's immoral.
It's setting out a system of morals for everybody.
And as we pointed out last session on verses 26 and 27, if the injury is to the point that they lose an eye or even lose a tooth, you got to let them go. And at that point that you're letting them go, they're free and clear of whatever debt that they owe you. So again, all this stuff serves as deterrence to the people that are overseers or over these people that have put themselves.
Again, I will agree here. It seems by and large that if speaking just of Hebrew slaves, keep in mind all of the stuff in Exodus, these are the rules you are to set before them, and the them is Hebrews. These are laws protecting your fellow Hebrew slaves. But yeah,
is to the point that they lose an eye or even lose a tooth.
Yeah, if the argument here is that if you cause like grievous permanent bodily injury to a slave, that you have to set them free, yeah, I most likely that is the case. That seems to be how it reads, but you're kind of contradicting yourself, because do you set them free, or do you lose an eye, and do you lose a tooth, or both? I think if you put out your fellow Israelites' eye, you will also lose an eye. But they're separate for the slave. Your punishment is not losing an eye, it's losing your slave. That seems like it's not equally applied, like you just claimed it is.
You got to let them go. Then at that point that you're letting them go, they're free and clear of whatever debt that they owe you. So again, all this stuff serves as deterrence to the people that are overseers or over these people that have put themselves into servitude to them.
Owners, stop dancing around the bush. These people who own people, overseers, masters, rulers, owners.
And again, it mentions losing an eye or losing a tooth. It doesn't mention every body part. You know, it'd be a long list if you mentioned every body part. But the judges would then take that principle and apply it. Hey, this person's maimed. You blew out their knee or broke their foot, and that's an abuse. They have to be set free. And there's judges that would decide this. It was all, everybody had to be treated.
You blew out their eye, or blew out their knee, or they lost their eye, so they have to be set free. But what just happened? You just said it. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Unless you're a slave, then it's wound for freedom. That's not equal. That's not equal. And also bear in mind that if you are to the point of starvation, that you're going to die, and the only salvation for you is to sell yourself into slavery, and then the slave master abuses you and you lose an eye, and you get set free, you're now in an even worse position than you were. Now you're starving with one less eyeball, or broken leg, or whatever it is. That's not setting the slave free isn't a solution to this problem.
Treated the same. And so I just find this, if we just read the passage.
The problem of starvation, setting the slave free, is a great solution to ending slavery, but he'll still be starving.
Then we end up with these answers. Try to make this say that it's giving freedom to owners to treat people like chattel property or to abuse them. It's just not true. Now down at verse 28, 29, it mentions there that if an ox gores anyone to death, whether they be bond or free, the punishment's the same in verse 28, 29. And then in verse 30 to 32, the only difference is that if the ox gores a son or a daughter without killing them, the parent can state the money payment due to them. If an ox gores a bond slaves without killing them, the payment's mandatory at 30 pieces of silver. Okay, so if it happens to a son or a daughter, the parent can mandate the money, but if it's a bond slave, it's got to be 30 pieces of silver. It's not a small chunk of change. It's a decent amount of money. So,
but the laws apply equal. I said this in the beginning of this video, that they go into, they say how the laws apply equally to everybody, slave and free, and then they go into detail of all the ways that it isn't applied equally. In this case, if an ox gores a son or a daughter, the courts and the judges and the people can kind of demand what the price should be. But if it's a slave, it's 30 shekels of silver. No, maybe that is a big chunk of change. I don't know what 30 shekels is back in the day. But even if that's a really good payment, it's still not equal, because in one instance you get to kind of battle over how much you should be compensated, and in another instance it's set. That the laws are different. They are not applied equally. He's going through how the laws are not applied equally.
Okay, I've heard some people say, well, see, there's a difference between, well, they're not taking advantage. It just set a price because the bonds were different. And who's going to say what the price would be, because the amount that the bond slave owed was a different amount of money. So they just
maybe the judges
said, here's a standard price. So it's not, again, it's protecting people, not saying, oh, he only owed me a little bit, and he had worked off most of it, and so therefore I'm not going to pay him. No, you have to pay him. It's a guarantee of money, not a way to take any out. The idea that Exodus 21 creates this separate system.
The problem here is that it doesn't say about what the shekel amount is for the sons or daughters. What if the shekel amount for the sons or daughters is like 2,000 shekels? What if it's 31 shekels? The problem is that we don't know that answer. So without knowing that, 30 shekels could basically just be like pretty much nothing. And again, this applies to Hebrew slaves.
Justice is just false. It's just false. Anybody that says so.
According to this argument, let's go back to the war captive scenario. You're an opposing army, you do battle, and the Hebrews win, and they take all these war prisoners. These people who are hostile enemies against their nation, against God, the people who worshipped Moloch and were burning their babies, the Canaanites. If you have a Canaanite slave and he gets gored by an ox, you're telling me that that war prisoner is going to get paid 30 shekels of silver. You're out of your mind.
Is either not taking the time to look at the text carefully or intentionally.
And again, why wouldn't the Canaanite slave just run away in the first place? And then he's a free man.
Intentionally leaving sections out and only showing you other certain ones, or they're intentionally looking for things in the Bible to tell lies about, or all three of those, because the text says something quite different. It's actually protecting the lives of people that had an obligation to pay a debt. And that's what it's all about. Eye for eye is a command for equal punishment. What eye for an eye means, and tooth for a tooth, is that, okay, well, you came and hurt my pig, so I'm going to go over to your house and burn your whole house down and kill your whole family. No, it's if you hurt my pig, then you owe me a pig.
Right.
It's equal justice. That's what it means. Just a point.
Do you remember when we just read that if you beat a slave, you are not to be punished?
Point out one more time, Leviticus 24:22 says, quote, "There shall be one standard for you. It shall be for the stranger as well as the native." Now, the next passage, Steve, is in Numbers 31. And that's another one that is one of these kind of chestnut passages that comes up. We're going to start down in the middle of the chapter. But the key part here in Numbers 31 is at the beginning, they're going to war with Midian, which was one of these peoples of Canaan that were evil child sacrificers that were frying their babies alive on the hands of Molech, or in the specific case of Midian, they had
I thought that was the Canaanites, where it was everybody. I mean, bear in mind that the Hebrew people were doing this practice, if I recall correctly.
prostitutes. They had a lot of women that, as a religious ritual, were prostitutes. They had
Hell yeah.
seduced a lot of the men of Israel. So in Numbers 31:7, Israel comes and kills all the Midianite men. And then in verse 9, they captured the women. And in verse 14, Israel brings back the Midianite women to Moses. Now, Steve, what was the command from God to do with the entire population of Midian?
They were to put them to death.
They were to put them to death. They were to put all of them to death. Sounds awful cruel.
Yep.
Well, why would God command such a thing?
As you pointed out,
Because he's a barbaric monster.
they had been given chances to repent for hundreds of years.
They've been given chances to repent for hundreds of years. First off, back that up. Back that up with any type of historical document that they were given a chance to repent before God commanded their genocide. Let's keep going.
So we're doing very, very evil things. So here it's not a case of God just arbitrarily coming up and saying you need to kill these people. No, it's judgment.
So you have a group of people who are killing babies, and your solution to this is to go kill all the babies. To be fair, if there are no more babies left to be killed, that will stop the slaughter of the babies. That is true.
On these people for what they were doing and the way that they had acted.
And so what's going to happen here in this passage, and let's go ahead and read it. Steve, if you could start in Numbers 31 and read 15 to 18. So with this,
Don't do it. Don't do it. It literally says kill the children, the boys, the young men, kill the grown men, and kill the women who aren't virgins. They just want to keep the virgins. I'm gonna guess that he's gonna say that this was some type of what do you call it? Where you like mesh two cultures together, effectively getting rid of one of the other cultures. Integration, whatever it is, there's a name for it. I'm guessing he's going to say that, well, how do you stop this practice from being done? Kill all the people who were doing it and who could possibly do it in the future, and then take the virgins so you can integrate them into your population, and suddenly this ritual will go away. But bear in mind, this means that you're going to slaughter all of the children and all of the women who are not virgins. Now, why wouldn't you be able to integrate a non-virgin woman into your assimilation? Why wouldn't you be able to assimilate the non-virgin women into your population just as easily as you would be able to assimilate the virgin women? I don't know, but that doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is here is they wanted to keep the virgins because back in the day they got huge hard-ons for virgins. That virginity was held to an incredibly weird and high standard. So they wanted those virgins. And I'm going to just let you use your imagination as to why they wanted virgins. And then I can't even use my imagination to figure out why God wanted virgins, because some of the spoils of war, the gold, the virgin women, the donkeys and the cattle, God got a cut of that too. I really hope they go back before verse 15, because he's right. They skipped over a lot of that barbaric stuff. That's my guess as to what he's going to say that this was for. We'll see what he actually says.
We have this original command to go and kill all these people of Midian because they were evil people that God had given a chance to repent, and they had refused. In this case, it says they had this plague that had happened, which was...
Yeah, and that's another side note, is that so even if God did give them the chance to repent, God is omniscient. He already knew this entire time that they weren't going to repent. So why give hundreds of years of chances when you already know the outcome?
Basically venereal disease. They had temple prostitutes, and they had seduced the men of Israel to...
Oh, so they want to slaughter all of the... So if you have a population of people that are infected with STDs, you just kill them. I mean, I guess that could be an effective way to stop the STDs. Just kill them. Wow. I don't know if he's going to say the stuff that I was just talking about. It's a common apologetic that I've heard for this barbaric passage. Maybe he will touch on that. But if he's going to go with the fact that they killed the non-virgin women because they had STDs, how do you test for that? What kind of STDs were going around back, 3,500 years ago? Back that up with some historical context. What venereal diseases existed? I mean, maybe it's true, maybe they did. I think like some of the pharaohs had like syphilis or something to that effect. But you don't just slaughter an entire population because they have STDs, you monsters. By you monsters, I mean God. God's a monster.
To go have sex with these prostitutes, and there'd been a disease, a plague that had spread through the population because of these temple prostitutes. That's the...
Okay, so this is what I want him to back up with historical context. What is he talking about here? Even if there was, it kind of doesn't matter, because you could also take these temple prostitutes and just like put a marking on them, a tattoo, so people said, hey, these people have venereal diseases, you probably don't want to sleep with them. That would probably be a pretty effective way for Hebrews who already hated the Midianites, because they literally went to slaughter them and probably wouldn't voluntarily sleep with them anyway. But that could be it. You don't kill them. That's my point here. And what about the young boys?
The background for all of this. And when it talks about Peor, the sin of Peor, that's what it's talking about, is this sex slavery, the sex rituals that were going on.
He has no problem calling prostitution in a religious sense sex slavery, but he won't call selling your daughters
not going on is a sex slavery scheme on the part of Israel that God endorses. Our skeptical friends look at this through the eyeglasses of a sex-saturated society. We've gone so far off the deep end with sex in our society that when they spare the women here to be your own, the accusation is they turned them into sex slaves. Really, again, the law of Moses, it's more than just this one passage. Deuteronomy, Leviticus, half of Exodus, half of Numbers are all the Mosaic law. Deuteronomy 21, starting in verse 10 and following, gives specific instructions to Israel on what to do for wives that were taken from the people around them. The women could be taken as wives, but were not to be abused. It says that in there, and they could not be sold for money.
Okay, yes, this is definitely not so a religious prostitution is a form definitely a form of sex slavery, and maybe it was. I don't know. I don't care. But if you are to tell me that okay, so you're in an army and you go to a another nation and you break into somebody's house and you slaughter the mom or not the mom. Okay, yeah, the mom. You slaughter the mom, you slaughter the dad, you slaughter the three brothers, and you slaughter the daughter and the daughter's husband. And the only person left living from that family is the one virgin daughter. You can take that daughter and you have to let her grieve for like 30 days the fact that you yourself in front of her eyes just killed her entire family. She gets to grieve that for 30 days and then she gets to be your wife. Under what system would any sexual intercourse between those two people, the virgin woman of the family who her family was just slaughtered by you, what could possibly be consensual about that?
So they were, instead of killing them here in Midian, like God had originally commanded, what did Moses do in verse 15? What was his question?
Have you spared all the women?
Have you spared the women? Well, why would he ask that? Because they were supposed to kill them.
Right.
They were
right.
the ones
He says so casually, "Why'd you do that? You were supposed to kill him."
that had brought in the venereal disease. Why did you spare these people when they caused the problem in the first place?
Now the ones there though in 18, the ones that are allowed to spare are the ones that have not. They're basically virgins. They have not known men intimately, and so therefore, since they have not had intimate relationships and they're basically virgins, they do not have the disease. They're known that they would not have the disease because it's not as venereal disease. It's passed through sexual acts.
So these are not sex slaves. These were women
Right.
that were to be used as marriage, or they could use
To be They weren't sex slaves. They were women to be used as marriage. Okay.
them as servants, but they were people that
They weren't sex slaves. They were to be used as women and or used as marriage and servants, but not sex slaves.
through mercy, they had said, okay, well, we already have this plague going on, this venereal disease, so we're not
Through mercy, you, sir, are disgusting. You're you're a disgusting apologist in every aspect of your life. You may be a great person, but right here, right now, you're disgusting. You're immoral. You're giving monstrous apologetics.
going to take the prostitutes in. We'll go ahead and originally do what God commanded, which was destroy them. But
Ah, you don't destroy people. I don't know how to say this because it's so stupid. The things that he's saying right now are so dumb that you just get taken off guard. How do you explain to somebody that hey, this is atrocious and immoral when it's so obviously like it's like if somebody's like about to go do some heinous crime, I won't mention, get into details, but just some heinous crime, and you're like, hey, don't do that heinous crime, and they're like, why not? What would you immediately say? Like, well, because it's a heinous crime. It's in the title. You don't do it because it's a heinous.
the virgins, if you want to take them and marry them, now think of what that does. That basically incorporates them into Israel's society and culture. That destroys
Okay.
the
So
Midianite culture.
so he is doing the cultural assimilation argument. He's doing the STD argument, which is just bizarre. Come on, that's insane. If there's first off, how do you tell the people who you just slaughter them indiscriminately, whether they do have the venereal disease or whether they do not have how do you test for that? Did they have test strips? Did they do urine analysis back in the day? So no, you just kill them indiscriminately, whether they have the STD or not. Uh, it,
While saving the more innocent ones. That was the
you don't slaughter people because they have STDs. You don't do that. That's monstrous. Realistically, even if I were to you know what? Wow, he convinced me there wasn't immoral slavery in the Bible. Slavery in the Bible was actually a great thing meant to protect people. When your very next line is they slaughtered people because they may or may not have had an STD, you're just building a case against you. Now you have another thing that you have to defend. It like, so okay, fine, I was sold on the slavery thing, which I'm not, of course, but now justify God commanding a genocide of a population, that population being children and women, men, male children, and women who may have STDs.
Compromise that Moses allowed here. But again, you could not take them as just sex slaves, which is the accusation. In verse 16, in the matter of Peor, so the plague was among the congregation. The same sin was mentioned over in Joshua chapter 22, verse 17. It says, quote, is not the iniquity of Peor enough for us, from which we have not cleansed ourselves to this day, although a plague came upon the congregation? And so the plague and the consequences to it from the same sin of Peor by these Midianite prostitutes was still around many years later in Joshua's day.
Yeah.
And so that's the context.
Okay, I'm going to try to make this video a little bit shorter. It's already 46 minutes long, so I am going to go ahead and cut this video here. We're at 17, so we're only 17 minutes in. I don't want this to be a 5-hour video. We're going to cut it here, and we'll get into part 4 in the next one. If you made it this far, I really appreciate it. Thank you for watching. Subscribe, give me a thumbs up, drop a comment below. Let me know how disgusting you think these people are, or if you choose that you want to defend them, you can also do that in the comments, or jump on my stream and we'll chat about it. All right, take care.